Have you ever noticed that strange moment between sleep and wakefulness, when reality seems to warp and distort? That fleeting instant when something feels present, watching, perhaps even attacking you? We call these hypnagogic hallucinations, sleep paralysis, or simply nightmares. But what if these experiences aren't random neural misfirings or psychological anomalies? What if they are encounters with entities that ancient traditions recognized and named? We've been conditioned to dismiss these experiences as mere dreams, to relegate them to the realm of superstition. Yet what if the modern explanation, that these are simply brain chemistry imbalances, is itself the greatest deception? What if that moment of terror, that feeling of presence, that sense of being attacked just before you wake, is actually evidence of something the ancients understood, but we have forgotten? The veil between worlds thins in that twilight state, and perhaps it is precisely because you are about to. Wake up, truly wake up, that certain forces would prefer you remain in slumber. What if these attacks are not random, but targeted? Not meaningless, but meaningful. Not hallucinations, but interventions designed to keep you from remembering who you truly are. This is not about fear, but recognition. Not about paranoia, but awareness. For in understanding why these entities, these Archons, might attack you at your most vulnerable yet powerful moment, you may discover the key to your own liberation. The explanation lies buried in ancient wisdom, waiting to be unearthed, waiting to illuminate what happens in those shadowy moments between sleeping and waking. The term Archon comes to us from the Gnostic texts discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, ancient manuscripts buried in the Egyptian desert for nearly 2 millennia. These texts speak of entities that the Gnostics believed were created by the Demiurge, a false god who fashioned the material world as a prison for divine sparks of consciousness, our true selves. The Archons, according to these forbidden teachings, are the guardians of this prison, the enforcers of cosmic ignorance. The Gospel of Philip, one of these recovered texts, tells us, "The Archons want to deceive man, since they saw that he had a kinship with those that are truly good." In the Apocryphon of John, we learn that these entities brought about forgetfulness, fear, and division to maintain their control over humanity. These are not mere theological abstractions, but descriptions of forces that interact with human consciousness. What the ancient Gnostics understood, and what modern science is only beginning to glimpse, is that consciousness exists in multiple layers and dimensions. The hypnagogic state, that threshold between sleeping and waking, represents a momentary thinning of the veil that normally separates these dimensions. It is a moment of potential remembrance, a brief window when our divine spark might recognize its true nature. And that recognition is precisely what the Archons cannot allow. If you found yourself drawn to these hidden truths, perhaps it's not by chance. Perhaps something within you, that divine spark the Gnostics called pneuma, recognizes itself in these words. This space, this moment of contemplation, was created for those who sense there's more to reality than what we've been taught to perceive. The journey of awakening is not one we're meant to walk alone. Those who came before us left breadcrumbs along the path, symbols, teachings, and warnings preserved despite centuries of suppression. By walking together, by sharing these forgotten truths, we strengthen the light within each other. If this resonates within you, if you feel that stirring of recognition, join us in this exploration. Subscribe to continue this journey into the depths of consciousness and beyond the illusions that bind us. Each subscriber becomes another lamp in the darkness, another spark remembering its flame. For what we're discussing isn't merely intellectual curiosity. It's the remembrance of our true nature. In the Gnostic cosmology, our universe was not created by the ultimate divine source, but by a lesser deity, the Demiurge, who fashioned the material world in ignorance and sometimes malevolence. This Demiurge, often identified with the jealous God of the Old Testament, created Archons to help maintain control over his flawed creation. The word Archon itself means ruler or authority in Greek, revealing their fundamental nature as cosmic prison wardens. These Archons were described in various texts as having both non-physical and quasi-physical forms. Some were portrayed as ethereal entities of pure thought form, while others were described with animal features, often serpentine or reptilian. The hypostasis of the Archons, another Nag Hammadi text, describes them as rulers of darkness, who envy humanity because, unlike them, humans contain the divine spark of true spiritual consciousness. What makes the Archons particularly insidious in Gnostic thought is not merely their existence, but their method of control. They do not primarily use physical force, they use deception. They create what the Gnostics called the counterfeit spirit, a false reality that humans mistake for truth. They maintain their power not through chains, but through ignorance, not through prisons, but through illusions that we willingly accept. Sophia, divine wisdom personified as feminine, plays a crucial role in this cosmic drama. In many Gnostic accounts, it was her unauthorized creative act that inadvertently led to the Demiurge's birth. Yet it is also through her that the divine spark enters humanity, giving us the potential to transcend the archonic prison. This spark, this fragment of true divinity, lies dormant within us, waiting to be awakened. The Archons fear this awakening above all else. For when a human fully awakens to their divine nature, they are no longer subject to archonic control. They see through the illusion, the false reality, what the Gnostics called the simulation, long before modern philosophers conceived of reality as a matrix. This cosmic struggle between ignorance and gnosis, direct spiritual knowledge, isn't happening in some distant mythological realm. It's occurring within human consciousness itself, within your consciousness. The boundary between sleeping and waking isn't just a physiological transition. It's a metaphysical threshold where your consciousness momentarily touches both worlds, the material prison and your true spiritual home. And it is precisely at this threshold that you are most dangerous to the archonic system. What if these ancient myths aren't merely colorful stories, but sophisticated psychological models? What if the Demiurge, rather than being a literal cosmic entity, represents our ego-constructed reality, the false self we build and defend? What if the Archons symbolize the thought patterns, beliefs, and societal programs that maintain this false identity? Consider how our thoughts patrol the boundaries of our awareness, rejecting information that threatens our worldview, much like immune cells attack foreign invaders. These thought patterns, these inner Archons, weren't necessarily created by us. They were installed through education, media, cultural conditioning, and even transgenerational trauma. They maintain their control not through force, but through fear and desire, the twin engines of ego preservation. The hypnagogic state, that twilight consciousness between sleeping and waking, represents a unique threat to this system. In this state, the logical, analytical mind, the primary tool of the inner Archons, temporarily relaxes its grip. The boundaries between conscious and subconscious become permeable. Information normally kept segregated can suddenly flow together, creating new connections, new insights, potentially even spiritual awakening. Neuroscience has shown that during these transitional states, our brains produce theta waves associated with deep meditation, creativity, and spiritual experiences. The default mode network, the brain system associated with our sense of self, temporarily reconfigures. We become, for a brief moment, less identified with our constructed identity and closer to our essential nature. This is why genuine spiritual traditions worldwide have developed practices to deliberately induce similar states: meditation, contemplation, chanting, drumming, even certain plant medicines. These are technologies of consciousness designed to bypass the archonic thought patterns and touch something more fundamental in our being. But the inner archons don't surrender easily. When these boundary dissolutions occur naturally during the hypnagogic state, the ego defense system can react with alarm. The fear response activates. Strange sensations occur: pressure on the chest, inability to move, sensing a presence. The mind, desperate to maintain control, projects these sensations outward as threatening entities. The inner becomes outer. The psychological becomes seemingly physical. This doesn't mean these experiences aren't real. On the contrary, they're profoundly real, but real as inner phenomena rather than external entities. The attack is the ego's desperate attempt to prevent you from slipping beyond its control, from remembering what lies beyond its carefully constructed reality. Yet sometimes these experiences may indeed represent encounters with consciousness beyond our own, not necessarily malevolent entities, but aspects of the collective unconscious, or what some traditions call the spirit world. The boundaries between psychological and metaphysical explanations blur, just as the boundaries of consciousness itself blur in these twilight states. Perhaps the most profound insight is that whether these archons are literal entities or psychological processes ultimately matters less than recognizing their function. They maintain separation. They preserve the illusion of isolation, the fundamental deception that you are merely a biological organism in a mechanical universe, rather than an expression of consciousness itself. When you begin to wake up, truly wake up, to your nature beyond this illusion, something within you, and perhaps beyond you, will resist. This resistance isn't evidence that you're wrong. It's evidence that you're right. It's confirmation that you're approaching a boundary that the architects of your conditioning never intended you to cross. If these words resonate with the truth you've sensed but couldn't articulate, consider this a moment of recognition. Not everyone will understand this journey. Many are still deeply immersed in the counterfeit reality, taking the shadows on the cave wall for the whole of existence. If this understanding illuminates something within you, acknowledge it. Press the like button not as a social media gesture, but as a silent affirmation, a way of saying, "I remember." Each such acknowledgement strengthens the field of awakening consciousness, making it easier for others to remember too. This isn't about gathering likes or building an audience. It's about recognizing each other in a world designed to keep us isolated and forgetting. It's about creating a countercurrent to the forces of spiritual amnesia. When you acknowledge this truth, you're not merely interacting with a video. You're participating in the ancient mystery of anamnesis, the unforgetting of what we have always known but were conditioned to forget. Your recognition matters. Your remembrance creates ripples in the collective consciousness. In a very real sense, each awakening makes the next one easier. We are not separate minds, but facets of a greater awareness gradually remembering itself through us. Have you ever noticed how these hypnagogic experiences often occur during periods of spiritual growth or psychological transformation? They tend to cluster around times when you're questioning fundamental assumptions, exploring meditation or spiritual practices, or experiencing major life transitions. This is not coincidental. The threshold between sleeping and waking serves as a perfect metaphor for the greater awakening we all face. Just as you struggle to bring consciousness into that liminal space each morning, humanity collectively struggles to awaken from a deeper sleep, the sleep of separation, materialism, and spiritual amnesia. Think about your own experiences. Perhaps you felt that weight on your chest, that sense of being watched or even attacked just before fully waking. Maybe you've experienced sleep paralysis, where you're conscious but unable to move, often accompanied by terrifying sensations or visions. These experiences are remarkably consistent across cultures and throughout history. In Newfoundland, they speak of the old hag who sits on sleepers' chests. In Japan, they call it kanashibari, bound in metal. Medieval Europeans attributed it to demons or incubi. Modern science calls it a neurological glitch. But what if all these explanations are partial truths pointing toward a more complex reality? What's striking is how these experiences often involve a sense of malevolence, a feeling that whatever is present doesn't want you to wake up. This matches precisely what we would expect if these moments represent genuine opportunities for spiritual awakening that threaten the systems of control, whether psychological or metaphysical. Ask yourself, why would a simple neurological misfire consistently generate the same narrative across cultures, the narrative of being attacked or suppressed just before awakening? Why would evolution select for such a terrifying experience? Perhaps because these aren't merely random glitches, but meaningful encounters at the boundary of consciousness. Your daily awakening from sleep mirrors the greater spiritual awakening. Each morning, you transition from the dream world to waking reality, often forgetting the dreams that seemed so real moments before. Similarly, spiritual awakening involves recognizing that what we call waking life may itself be a kind of dream, a construction that obscures a deeper reality. The Archons, whether understood as literal entities or psychological forces, maintain their control by keeping you identified with this dream. They need you to forget upon waking. They need you to dismiss these boundary experiences as meaningless. They need you to stay within the parameters of consensus reality. But what happens when you bring awareness to these threshold moments? What happens when you recognize the pattern and maintain consciousness through the transition? Something remarkable occurs. The attacks begin to lose their power. The fear diminishes. The boundary becomes not a place of terror, but a doorway to expanded awareness. This is why spiritual practices often focus on cultivating present moment awareness. Meditation, mindfulness, contemplative prayer, these are technologies for maintaining consciousness across boundaries that normally fragment it. They train you to remain aware during transitions that typically involve forgetting. The integration of these disparate understandings, ancient Gnostic cosmology, modern psychology, neuroscience, and your own direct experience, reveals a profound truth. The boundary between sleeping and waking is not merely a physiological transition, but a metaphysical threshold. It's a place where different orders of reality meet and interact. The Archons, whether understood as autonomous entities or aspects of our own psyche, operate at this boundary. They function as guardians of consensus reality, working to ensure that when you cross from one state of consciousness to another, you don't bring with you the remembrance of what lies beyond. Yet, paradoxically, it is precisely their resistance that can alert you to the significance of these threshold experiences. The attack itself becomes a signpost, pointing toward what they don't want you to see. Their opposition becomes a form of confirmation. This understanding transforms fear into curiosity, terror into exploration. The presence you sense just before waking is no longer merely a threat, but a messenger, albeit one that communicates through opposition. The pressure, the paralysis, the fear, these become not just symptoms to be endured, but phenomena to be investigated with awareness. And in that investigation lies the potential for liberation. For when you bring consciousness to the very mechanisms designed to suppress consciousness, something remarkable happens. The system begins to unravel. The illusion becomes transparent. The Archons, whether inner or outer, lose their power to deceive. This is the deeper meaning of Christ's words in the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. The divine spark within must be recognized and expressed, or the very forces designed to suppress it will bring suffering. The attacks that occur just before waking are not evidence of your weakness, but of your power. They don't demonstrate your vulnerability, but your potential. They aren't happening because you're failing, but because you're succeeding. Succeeding in bringing consciousness where unconsciousness normally reigns. So the next time you experience that strange, frightening moment between sleeping and waking, remember, this may be more than a quirk of brain chemistry. It may be an encounter at the boundary of worlds. An opportunity to recognize the forces that maintain the illusion, a chance to remember what lies beyond the veil. And in that remembrance lies freedom. Not freedom from the experience, but freedom through the experience. The freedom that comes from recognizing its significance and maintaining awareness despite the fear. For what the Archons fear most is not your resistance, but your recognition, your capacity to see them for what they are, and therefore move beyond their influence. What if these hypnagogic attacks are actually initiations in disguise? What if they represent not random neurological events, but meaningful encounters designed to test and, ultimately, strengthen your consciousness? Throughout history, spiritual traditions have recognized that awakening isn't a smooth, comfortable process, but often involves confronting the very forces that maintain spiritual sleep. The Tibetan Buddhists speak of wrathful deities who appear terrifying, but actually serve the awakening process. The Christian Desert Fathers wrote of the dark night of the soul and demonic attacks that preceded spiritual breakthrough. Indigenous shamanic traditions worldwide recognize that encounters with frightening entities often precede healing and expanded awareness. These traditions understood something modern psychology is only beginning to rediscover. Transformation requires facing what we fear. Growth demands encountering resistance. Awakening necessitates meeting the guardians of the threshold. When you experience these attacks at the boundary of sleep and waking, you're encountering your own threshold guardians, whether they manifest from within your psyche or from dimensions beyond it. They appear threatening precisely because they mark the boundary of your current identity. They represent the fear of dissolution that precedes expansion. By bringing awareness to these experiences, by neither fighting them in terror nor fleeing them in avoidance, you transform their energy. The very force that seemed to attack you becomes fuel for awakening. The guardian of the threshold becomes, paradoxically, the one who ushers you through. This alchemical transformation, turning fear into awareness, resistance into breakthrough, represents the deeper pattern of spiritual awakening. It's not about escaping the Archons, but about recognizing their role in the greater process. Not about avoiding the threshold, but about crossing it consciously. Perhaps we've been mistaken all along about these experiences. Perhaps they aren't attacks meant to harm us, but intense encounters designed to awaken us. Perhaps what feels like suppression is actually an invitation to a more expanded state of being, if only we can maintain awareness through the fear. Remember, the Archons maintain their power through deception, not force. Their primary weapon is fear itself, the fear that keeps you contracted, identified with the limited self, unwilling to risk the dissolution that precedes expansion. When you recognize this, the experience transforms. What once seemed like an attack becomes a catalyst. What once triggered terror now evokes curiosity. You were never meant to sleep forever. You were meant to remember. And perhaps these strange, frightening moments between worlds are not obstacles to that remembrance, but portals to it. If only you can see them with new eyes. What if the light you've been seeking was never actually lost? What if the awakening you desire isn't something to be achieved, but something to be recognized? Perhaps the Archons don't attack you to prevent something new from happening, but to prevent you from recognizing what has always been true. The ancient Gnostics understood that our fundamental problem isn't ignorance, but forgetting. We don't need new information. We need to remember what we've always known beneath the layers of conditioning and cosmic amnesia. The divine spark was never extinguished. It was only covered, veiled by the illusions we've accepted as reality. Those moments between sleeping and waking, those threshold experiences where strange presences seem to attack or suppress you, may be the times when the veil momentarily thins. The pressure, the fear, the paralysis aren't happening because you're further from truth in those moments, but because you're closer to it than ever. The Archons don't fear your seeking, they fear your finding. They don't oppose your questions, they oppose your answers. They don't attack because you're lost, they attack because you're on the verge of remembering the way home. So the next time you experience that strange twilight state, that boundary between worlds where presences seem to gather and resistance intensifies, remember, this may be the moment when you're closest to awakening. Not an awakening to something new, but a remembrance of what you've always been beneath the dream of separation. The attacks don't define you. Your awareness of them does. The fear doesn't confine you. Your response to it does. The boundary doesn't limit you. It simply marks the edge of an identity you've outgrown. And in that recognition lies liberation. Not from the experience, but through it. Not despite the Archons, but because of what encountering them reveals about your own capacity for awareness. For in the end, perhaps the greatest discovery isn't that forces exist which seek to keep you asleep, but that nothing can ultimately prevent you from waking up. Have you experienced these strange encounters at the edge of sleep? That moment when something seems to press against you just as consciousness returns? Share a single word below that captures your feeling during these experiences. Write "awake" if you've found yourself recognizing these moments as opportunities rather than just terrors. Your word might help others recognize their own experiences in a new light. We are not meant to walk this path of remembrance alone. Each recognition strengthens all of us on the journey beyond the Archon's reach.